Machiavelli's Prince is a book we teach here at Hillsdale College. It's important for a couple of reasons. He wrote it in the early 16th century, and he lived in a time where he thought, and there's a very good case to be made that he was right, Western political orders were weak, divided, and hence going to be preyed upon amongst each other, but also by civilizationally foreign powers. And he wanted to address that, and he wanted to address especially the spiritual condition that made that possible, a kind of lassitude. Well, we'll just sit back and hope, rely on hope, and that we're favored by God and that things will just work out. And he thought that was a real problem. And one of the reasons he wrote The Prince, one of the very important reasons, was to try and convince people we need to have a very different attitude about those things. Some of the most important aspects of Machiavelli's advice, which are kind of shocking, because again, he's regarded as and there's a good defense to be made of this. He's amoral. His book is a handbook for tyrants, and that I think is mistaken. I mean, there's a case to be made for it, but I think it's mistaken because almost counterintuitively to what you think Machiavelli is arguing, and he does it on a very cynical basis. It's always, this is useful for the prince to follow. And it turns out it's useful for the prince to respect and protect the people of his regime. To not harass them, to not give them burdensome taxes, to not mess with their family life, to treat them well so they'll be loyal. Now, he's doing that so they'll be loyal to him, and you can be successful politically. But the result is, if you moralize this, and later thinkers, people who follow Machiavelli in some ways, like Hobbes and Locke most famously, you actually get something like what we call limited government. Put that on a principled basis. Whenever possible, Machiavelli wants an armed populace, which is not what tyrants never want, an armed populace. The people are the real refuge, the real security of the prince. And so that means the people have to be treated well so they'll be loyal. And that is just key advice for Machiavelli. I think it's only fair to admit that I'm presenting what to many scholars, many students of Machiavelli would be a heterodox viewpoint, that he ultimately points towards moral considerations that it would be wise for anyone interested in sound statesmanship and good politics to pursue. A common view among political theorists is that there's a famous phrase about this, that Machiavelli is a teacher of evil. And now the fellow that came up with that phrase, I'm not sure, is a man named Leo Strauss. I'm not sure he even ultimately thought that. Some of the really interesting aspects of The Prince that make it, I think, still very much relevant today. So there's, in part, we study these things because of their effect on other thinkers or what they show you about a particular time, and those are important and legitimate considerations. I think it's always very important to think about what relevance does this have for me, for my students, for my fellow citizens. And The Prince it's funny, Machiavelli's notoriously amoral. He never likes to say good and bad. You should do this because it's good in the normal way of thinking about that. But in the course of discussing what he calls the effectual truth, what's the thing that matters when you're thinking about this? What works? He often winds up giving advice that is moral because he's addressing these practical concerns. What do you need to have a successful nation? What are the dangers and benefits of conquest, of a foreign power? That if his practical maxims are followed, his general advice is pursued, would lead to moral and useful policy outcomes. And this is all related to, again, not just relying on hope and good intentions and, we're behaving well, so then that means nothing bad will happen to us. Machiavelli thinks you have to think about the extreme circumstance, tough situations. He's very much an emphasis on you need to be armed, and he means that not just he does mean it in the normal sense of having weapons and being proficient in their use, but also the attitude that makes that possible. Like the first study of The Prince is the study of military affairs, what we would call military science. It's the first and most important thing a prince does. One of the ways we see Machiavelli's cynical, amoral advice leading to a non-cynical and moral outcome is He's an advocate, a passionate advocate of what he calls cruelty well used. And this is, if you're just a good person, which we should all try to be, this should be troubling to you to think of, well, cruelty. But then when he defines what cruelty well used is, it's cruelty that's good for the prince, but it's useful for the people. And so when he gets into examples, it's especially things like protecting them from lawlessness. That's punishing criminals. He casts as a type of cruelty. And then, I think you could very reasonably make a strong case that punishing people who harm others is not cruel. He puts it in this way that makes it sound troubling, and it should be initially troubling. What does he mean by that? Well, you shouldn't do it. He says cruelty. This is the fundamental maxim the prince should follow is to employ. He says it's where he puts his faith is in cruelty well used. It's a very shocking language, but then it turns out that he really means things like punishing malefactors and, keeping foreign enemies away and fighting them when necessary. It seems like the actual content of the advice is actually good in that normal, decent understanding. There's another famous passage in Machiavelli which is shocking again to the decent people. It's better to be feared rather than loved. Yes, he says this, and then, of course, it's best to be both if you can have it, but sometimes you can't have both. And he chooses fear, but I think he especially, in the examples he gives when he gets into it, it's especially, you should fear the majesty and power of the prince as he secures the regime and the people. In other words, we would think of it as being, someone might think of violating a law, to put it in contemporary terms, but not do it because they're afraid of the majesty of the laws. They might get caught, they might get punished, they'll be shamed, they might be put in prison or fined. It turns out that fear is something you have to have it because it's secure. All regimes rely on this to some. They usually just don't put it in those terms, but they rely on the courts, the police, things like that, to ultimately for malefactors to be restrained. And then other people, normal good citizens, are restrained especially by the fear of shame and things like that. And ideally, they don't want to even do these bad things, but you can't count that that's going to be terribly widespread, I think, for Machiavelli's realistic assessment of human nature. The term Machiavellian has these connotations of someone who's utterly, ruthless, amoral, cynical, and in a way that's fair to Machiavelli because that's how he presents himself. Another good example of this, we've talked about some other examples, is that he says it's a natural and ordinary thing to want to acquire, and some people think that means he's just simply pro-conquest. You go out and conquer the world, and that's fine. It's normal. It's normal behavior, natural and ordinary. Well, then he gets into all the difficulties of conquest, and how it can actually harm a regime to do it. So again, it's cynical advice in the sense of he's not talking about this in the way thinkers in the just war tradition would talk about it. Like, do you have a right cause? He doesn't get into that. But in pointing out the practical difficulties that often attend thoughts of expansion and things like that, it provides a powerful check on people aside, in addition to that moral advice we find in our tradition. The Machiavelli's overtly cynical rhetoric it makes one wonder, why would he do this? And I think this becomes clear if we look at some of his successors. Someone like John Locke is often following Machiavelli's advice, but he puts it in a moral framework. So he too wants to secure the people. He wants them to be protected in their property and their family life, and he makes that a matter of morality. He makes that a matter of principle. Machiavelli lived in a world where he thought people were overly moralistic in their speech and in their thought, not necessarily in their deeds. And I think he wanted a kind of shock therapy, his brutally realistic advice to push people out of that, what he thought is sort of stupor of moralistic blather and into thinking clearly about the world. It causes many decent people to turn away. It did lead to some very, I think, beneficial developments in human thought. In other words, there's all this talk of virtue, but the reality was often low character and political instability and weakness, which led to terrible evils. Let's rectify that. Let's shock people out of this condition. In a way, I think we would be benefited if our political leaders were more Machiavellian in the way I've been discussing it. If they thought more of the consequences of their actions, of the practical difficulties of what they're doing. Often just having the right attitude or expressed orientation seems to be, that's enough to do that.